Okay, it looks like we've got everyone here who's coming from class. So I want to thank you very much for coming to this panel addressing climate displacement globally and locally. I'm Bonnie Docherty. I'm a senior clinical instructor in the International Human Rights Clinic. And this panel is a part of a 2-day conference on climate change displacement. We've brought a collection of experts from around the world to look at the issue of climate change displacement, particularly focusing on 4 case studies, although we'll take a broader look here today. And we're slowly wrapping up some very constructive internal discussions, but we also wanted to share the discussion with the broader audience at Harvard. Yesterday, some of you may have attended the conversation between Dean Minow and Mary Robinson, and today we have a distinguished panel of 3 experts that will discuss the international and domestic approaches to dealing with climate displacement and examine how the global and local efforts can work together and learn from each other. So given the limited time we have, I'll keep the introductions brief, but we'll introduce you in the order that you guys are speaking. So first, on my left, I have Jane McAdam, Director and Professor of Law at Andrew and Renata Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law at the University of New South Wales. Jane is also a Fellow at the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and has affiliations with a number of related organizations and institutions, notably Oxford University's Refugee Studies Centre, the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Norway, and the Refugee Law Initiative in London. She has also published widely in international refugee law and forced migration, with a very impressive number of 9 books, most in 2012, I guess it's the most recent, but at least one of the most relevant, Climate Change, Forced Migration, and International Law by Oxford University Press. To her left is Walter Kälin, who is one of the world's leading experts on international human rights law, with an emphasis on internally displaced persons and refugees. He's held a number of key positions in this field over the years. Notably, he was an envoy of the chairmanship for the Nansen Initiative, which she'll be discussing today. He was a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee. He's a recently retired professor of law at the University of Bern, and he is formerly representative of the UN Secretary General on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons from 2004 to 2010. And finally, we have Robin Bronen, who is a human rights attorney who has been researching and working on climate-induced relocation of Alaskan Native communities since 2007. She's executive director for the Alaska Institute for Justice, which she co-founded, senior research scientist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and she's also worked with the White House Council on environmental quality to implement President Obama's Climate Change Task Force recommendation to address climate displacement. So with that, I'll turn it over to the panelists, and we'll hear what they have, some opening remarks from them. I'll ask a few questions, and we'll open it up to the audience. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, and it's a great pleasure to be here to address you today on this really important and challenging topic. On average, 1 person is displaced every second by a disaster. On average, that means about 26 million people a year are newly displaced by disasters, which is almost 3 times the number than are displaced by conflict. Now, most of these people move within their own countries rather than across international borders, but there are certainly some gaps in legal frameworks when people do cross borders, and I'll come to those in a moment. This is a phenomenon that affects virtually every region in the world. Whether we look at the South Pacific, if we consider Cyclone Pam, which occurred there in 2015, it was estimated that up to 70% of Vanuatu's population were displaced internally, but nonetheless displaced in the immediate aftermath of that disaster. The other point to note there is that this is likely to happen more often, given that cyclones and other extreme weather events are becoming increasingly frequent and or intense, which is consistent with climate change. If we go to another part of the globe, Alaska, we see that there is far less sea ice in the Arctic Ocean than ever before, and the permafrost in Alaska is melting. This is resulting in rapid erosion and flooding, threatening the livelihoods and well-being of people residing there. And as Robin will note, it's jeopardising the ongoing inhabitability of the land, prompting communities to request permanent relocation elsewhere. There are a number of factors that we need to consider when we are trying to understand this phenomenon of climate change or disaster-related displacement. And the first is that I'm going to talk precisely about those two things, climate change and disasters. The reason for that's twofold. First of all, many disasters are exacerbated by climate change, such as increased cyclone intensity, whereas other disasters like tsunamis or earthquakes are generally not. But of course, their impacts can be just as devastating when it comes to people's protection needs and their human rights. So it makes little sense to distinguish between the two. Secondly, for those who are climate skeptics, the fact that, or the reality that disasters are already impacting on people and people are moving means that this is an issue that needs to be addressed irrespective of underlying causes. So how are we going to respond to the considerable legal and policy challenges that the phenomenon throws up? The second big point is that we are discussing a multi-causal phenomenon. The impacts of climate change don't cause displacement on their own. It doesn't matter which part of the world we look at, what is clear is that they overlay existing vulnerabilities like impoverishment, environmental degradation, resource scarcity, lack of livelihood opportunities, and so on. And generally, the people who will be most affected are those who are already living in precarious circumstances. The third point is that climate change acts as a threat multiplier. It magnifies risk. So the way I tend to frame this is that disasters become disasters on steroids in intensity or frequency. But climate change is also a process. Slow onset impacts like sea level rise or desertification take place over time, resulting in a more gradual deterioration of living conditions that may ultimately mean people can't live in particular parts of the world. The fourth point is, though, that there is a constant dialogue between the slower climate processes and the more rapid onset events. So slower processes like sea level rise can actually exacerbate more sudden onset disasters like storm surges, king tides, and flooding. Cumulatively, these things can weaken people's resilience over time and contribute to further displacement. Final preliminary point here is that each community will experience the adverse impacts of climate change and disasters in different ways. And even within communities, of course, different individuals will have different tipping points. In fact, what transforms a hazard into a disaster is that people's coping capacity has become exceeded. This is why good governance is so crucial. The nature and the timing of the policy interventions that we take now will play a huge role in determining the outcomes after a disaster. They can influence whether people move at all, whether they are displaced for prolonged periods of time, what resources they can access and how readily, and whether they have options to move to more secure areas to rebuild their lives. For instance, if building codes are implemented and enforced, then people will be safer. If disaster warning systems are in place, then people will have more time to get themselves out of harm's way. All the evidence tells us that generally people want to remain in their homes for as long as they can, and they want to go back there as quickly as possible if they are displaced. But if people can't live in safety, dignity, and with access to livelihoods, then they may seek to move on. Current legal protection frameworks don't provide a ready means for people to cross borders in anticipation of future environmental harm, even though, of course, it's entirely rational for people to calculate the future risks and decide that they'd rather leave now while they can than stay and wait for the situation to become intolerable. But under international law, only a handful of forced migrants are already recognised as people whom other countries have an obligation to protect. They are refugees, stateless people, and those eligible for complementary protection under human rights law. Very briefly, I'll run through the gaps in those regimes, but also where perhaps they may have some buy-in for people. There are cogent reasons why international refugee law will generally not be the answer for people displaced in the context of climate change and disasters. Refugee law requires somebody to show that they have a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of their race, religion, political opinion, nationality, or membership of a particular social group. Now, in general, the impacts of disasters or climate change won't satisfy these. First hurdle is showing persecution, which generally requires some human agency, and the jurisprudence as it stands now would not accept the impacts of a disaster or climate change process as constituting persecution. And if anything here, we're as the New Zealand court said, turning the Refugee Convention on its head, because arguably the persecutor, that is states that have failed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, if we want to frame it in that way, would be the very countries to which people might be fleeing, such as the United States or, in my case, Australia. But the second obstacle is that even if we could overcome that hurdle of the definition of persecution, it then has to be linked to one of those 5 grounds I mentioned, race, religion, and so on. And the impacts of climate change and disasters are, of course, indiscriminate. So refugee law generally won't provide a means for people to receive protection, although the New Zealand courts have said that if people find themselves caught up in the aftermath of a disaster, where the government withholds humanitarian assistance to a particular segment of the community, for instance, because of their religion, or fails to provide access to safe land, again for a convention reason, then that might found a conventional refugee claim. So the idea here would be it's not the disaster that's the persecution, it's the broader context that leads to a more traditional refugee claim. International human rights law does protect people from being forcibly returned to life-threatening conditions. So under the various treaties, people are precluded from return to a situation where they'd face arbitrary deprivation of life or cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment. It's quite possible that if we look cumulatively at the conditions in certain parts of the world where people don't have access to fresh water, to safe shelter, to livelihoods, being able to grow crops and so on, that at some point in time, that threshold of either a risk of being arbitrarily deprived of life or of being subjected to degrading or inhuman treatment would come to pass. Courts have already recognised that dire humanitarian conditions can amount to inhuman or degrading treatment. So there is a precedent for this, although the threshold is always high. But I think here one of the obstacles will be timing, because courts or decision makers today look at what will happen to you tomorrow. And if it may well be safe for people to return right now, but if you look 50 years down the track, it may not be. And that's, I guess, one of the difficulties with applying human rights law. I don't have time to address the question of statelessness other than to say that that regime is also ill-fitting, and it's certainly not the answer when it comes to small island states where people may have to relocate. That regime is not going to give much protection to people. So in conclusion, I think it's very important to connect up the dots between different policy areas, climate change, disasters, food security, development, urbanisation, and other areas, because this is a cross-cutting issue that needs holistic thinking and 360-degree approaches. We need to be proactive, not just reactive, and I think we need to recognise that inaction is not a neutral position, but it's a deliberate choice about the future. So every decision that's made today, or the lack of taking a decision, will have future consequences. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jane. And Walter?
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me to this conference and to this panel. It's great to be back at the law school. I do have to admit that I don't remember the law school to be as luxurious as this when I got my LLM in '84, quite a long time ago. Jane, just as mentioned, 1 person per second on average displaced by a sudden onset disaster. And depending on the year, that's 80–90% people displaced by weather or climate-related events. That's a reality. She was talking about the need to bring together different strands of discussion, like disaster risk reduction, migration, human rights protection, etc. And this is what the Nansen Initiative tried to do. Well, I remember a meeting of the heads of humanitarian agencies and organizations where then High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, our next Secretary General of the United Nations, said, I'm troubled looking at what the climate change negotiators are discussing. They're discussing greenhouse gases, they are talking about carbon emissions, they are talking about coral bleaching, they are talking about many things, but they are not talking about people. And we, the humanitarians, we are faced with large numbers of people being already displaced, and we, the humanitarians, have to respond to that. And more people will be displaced in the future. This led us to then start to lobby for the inclusion of the issue of displacement, migration, planned relocation into the climate change negotiations. All we got 2010 in Cancun was 3 lines admitting this is one of the challenges to adapt to climate change: forced displacement, voluntary migration, and planned relocation in the context of global warming. 2011, this was the 60th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention. High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, put the issue on his anniversary agenda. There was a big conference in Oslo, the Nansen Conference, on climate change and displacement. And at the end of the year, he wanted to get green light from the ministers attending a ministerial meeting in Geneva to really start to discuss the issue within the UN. No way to do that. There was total rejection of the idea to even discuss the issue. And it was in that context that Norway and Switzerland stood up and pledged that they would facilitate a state-led, bottom-up consultative process with those states and governments, but also with civil society who were interested in the issue. And this was the start of the Nansen Initiative, and I had the honor and pleasure to act as the envoy of the chairmanship, Norway, Switzerland, for this state-led process. State-led meaning a small group of states from different parts of the world. We had, besides Australia, countries like Bangladesh, the Philippines, Kenya, Costa Rica, Mexico, supporting that endeavor. And we did organize a series of regional, sub-regional consultations all over the world with governments, but also with civil society, and with a lot of involvement of academia that provided the input, because we wanted to have discussions that were informed. Out of it came, after 3 years of these consultations, a nice document. Here it is. The agenda for the protection of cross-border displaced persons in the context of disasters and climate change. What is the protection agenda about? First, it really reflects the consensus that was emerging from these consultations. And we were very happy just a year ago from now in Geneva to have 109 out of 114 states endorsing the document. Only one state was against. The others hadn't received instructions in time. So quite a strong endorsement if you're thinking that this was a process outside the UN. Usually nowadays these things are within the international organizations. The protection agenda first is conceptualizing the issue of displacement in the context of climate change, disasters, and in a minute I will tell you how. It is collecting and presenting a rich array of effective practices, how to address the issue, and then it sets an agenda on what to do. The protection agenda, I think, has helped to put the issue now solidly on the international agenda. Today, it's no longer like in 2011 that you can talk about it. Today, it is, we have seen it just on the 19th of September at the summit in New York, something states are ready to discuss. And another effect of the Nansen Initiative was to frame messages and feed them into important international processes. For instance, if you're looking at the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction, it contains language on migration, on relocation, on forced displacement, and it was very much the Nansen group of states that pushed that through. It was difficult, but in the end we got it. So, in terms of how to conceptualize and frame the issue, we just heard from Jane that people, even if they have to flee across borders, are not refugees as defined by international law. Now, many have suggested that we should enlarge the notion of a refugee and recognize that persons fleeing across borders for reasons of climate change and its effects should be recognized as refugees. What has come out of the consultations was this would not be a good idea. Why? Just imagine you're a climate change asylum seeker. And first you have to prove, to show, at least to make it credible, that the weather event that displaced you, that forced you out, the flooding, the windstorm, would not have happened without global warming. The issue of attribution. Science is not there yet to attribute one single weather event to global warming, because there always have been windstorms and flooding. Second, as we have heard, flight is always multi-causal. It's not just the fact that there was a natural hazard, but very much also the fact that people couldn't get protection and assistance within their own country, that people are too vulnerable. Many, many reasons to multi-causality. We don't have time to look into that, but maybe in the discussion we can come back to that. And again, as an asylum seeker, probably decision makers will tell you, no, you came here for economic reasons. Poverty, not climate change. There was one decision in New Zealand, the first climate change refugee, as the media called him, he was not the first one, a very good decision that outlines exactly how difficult it is to show what exactly are the causes. And then who should deserve protection abroad? Everyone affected by climate change? Probably not. So these were the kind of challenges. And then, in addition, and what about those displaced by non-climate change-related hazards, earthquakes? We all remember Haiti. Several 100,000 people showed up in this region at the borders of all the different countries. Should they be excluded? Wouldn't it be discriminatory to not look at them? So this was the big challenge for us. The solution we found was not to talk about climate change refugees, but to look at disaster-displaced persons. What is a disaster? A disaster is a situation where the damage caused by a hazard is too big for a given society or even country to cope with it. A disaster occurs when those affected are no longer to cope with the effects of the impact of the natural hazard. And that's where people need, under certain circumstances, protection and assistance abroad. So the entry point for us is disasters. Disasters linked to climate change, but we don't have to show that they were caused by climate change. It's sufficient to show that people would not get the necessary protection and assistance inside their own country if sent back. And this was an idea we found was already reflected in the practices of states. We identified more than 50 states who in the past decades have admitted cross-border disaster-displaced persons. And usually it was exactly that kind of idea. If we would send these people back, they would be exposed to the kind of hardship, the lack of protection and assistance that makes it really not legitimate to send them back. So, that's one entry point. To define, not to find, but to conceptualize those in need and worthy of protection as those who are forced out because the impact is a disaster and not just something a society, a country can cope with. But we also felt that this is not sufficient. In our first consultation in the Pacific, Cook Islands in Rarotonga, we had a civil society leader, Penelisa Alofa from Kiribati. That's one of the small island states most likely to disappear first as an effect of sea level rise. And she said, we don't want to become refugees. Please help us not to become refugees. We don't want a refugee status. We know we will have to leave our countries. But we want to have at least some measure of deciding for ourselves when to go and where to go. What we want are possibilities for voluntary migration. Voluntary not in the sense that we really have a choice to stay, but voluntary in terms of when to go and where to go. So what we want is pathways to regular migration as a form to cope, to adapt to the realities of climate change. So this brought us really to the idea to really look at what can we do to manage displacement risks so that people are not ending up in humanitarian emergency situations. And there is quite a lot we can do. When are people displaced? Under what circumstances? 3 elements. There is a natural hazard. Second, people are exposed to the natural hazard. And third, they are too vulnerable to resist, to cope. So, for instance, rising sea levels, the Dutch, yes, they are exposed, and there is rising sea levels, but they are not vulnerable. They're just building their dams and strengthening their dams, so they are not displaced. So if you look at the 3 elements, the good message is we can influence all these 3 elements. In the context of climate change, the hazard, this is about mitigation, about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then we might have a world with 1.5 centigrades warming or 2 and not 4. And we know this will mean that less people will have to move. We can try to influence exposure by moving people out of harm's way before the hazard strikes. This is about planned relocation. And we have discussed this in the context of Alaska, and we will hear from Robin about that. Or we can facilitate migration as an adaptation measure. And I'm talking not about irregular migration, not about the people crossing the Mediterranean Sea, losing their lives there because they have no regular legal pathways to security. And we can try to influence vulnerability. This is about disaster risk reduction. This is about climate change adaptation. This is about building resilience. This is about so many measures. So there are policy options. And the protection agenda then sets out priority areas for these different possibilities for policy interventions, for action. We need more data, more knowledge. We need to kind of harmonize, formalize, make predictable the effective practices. They're very haphazard and small, but it's good ideas. And we, again, can come back to that maybe during the discussion. And we really need to enhance the management of disaster risks. The Nansen Initiative closed office end of last year, but not to end all activities. There is a successor set up. It's called the Platform on Disaster Displacement. And in terms of chairing it, Germany and Bangladesh took over from Switzerland and Norway. They are now in the lead. And again, it's a group of states, this time even a bigger group of states that are driving the process. And the task of the Platform on Disaster Displacement is really to work towards the implementation of the protection agenda. We just had a meeting 10 days ago in Geneva on this work plan, and it's really looking exciting. And there's a lot of excitement among many states, not all of them, but many, who realize climate change is a reality, climate change-related displacement is a reality, and this is the time to do something about it. And I'm really encouraged about seeing the kind of dynamic that there is there. We'll see how long it will last, but I think the pressure is there. And that's why I'm quite confident that governments understand that, and we will make some progress, some steps back, some steps forwards, but still the direction is the right one. Thank you very much.
Walter and Robin?
Thank you. So I'm going to show some slides about what's happening in Alaska. And I just want to thank Harvard Law School for inviting me and my colleagues from Alaska here and to bring the Arctic into the focus of the lower latitudes. So this is a map that I always start my presentations with, and this is a map that's done by NOAA every month to show temperature anomalies. And the reason why I'm going to start with it today is because I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Paris Agreement and how the governments of the world decided that we were going to try globally to hold our temperature increase at aspirationally to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is a map from February of this year, and if you look at the far left corner of the map, you can see Alaska is burnt red, which is showing in February of this year, we were already off the charts at 5 degrees Celsius increase. For the last 2 winters in the city where I live, Anchorage, we have had no snow. And the increased temperature anomalies are causing drastic decreases in Arctic sea ice. So Jane mentioned it, but I think it's really important to understand, and Mary Robinson yesterday talked about the urgency for action, because Arctic sea ice is leaving the Arctic Ocean. In February of this year, when this map was done, for the first time we had a record low maximum extent of Arctic sea ice. So every February, the NASA and NOAA measure the extent of Arctic sea ice to see, how much it's increased during our winter season. They've been doing it since 1979. And so this was the first time that we had a record low. And then in September is when they mark when it's the record minimum extent of Arctic sea ice. And this year we had the second lowest in the last now 8 years. So the loss of Arctic sea ice is having a dramatic impact on coastal communities in Alaska. Arctic sea ice is the natural seawalls that have protected communities for centuries. And without that Arctic sea ice and these warming temperatures, we are getting extreme erosion. And I don't know with the lighting if you can see this. These are photographs that were just sent to me by Stanley Tom, who was the former tribal administrator in Newtok, and from whom I have learned everything that you're going to hear today. And this extreme erosion, in the far left corner, you can see the village of Newtok. They are surrounded by water and they are losing intense amounts of land. And they have made the decision decades ago that they needed to relocate, along with 2 other communities, Shishmaref and Kälin. And in 2009, the federal government issued one of many studies and identified 12 communities that needed to relocate. Now, the methodology that they used to make that determination was not accurate. This is a really old map, but it gives you an idea of the scale of the problem. And to understand Alaska, all of these villages, there are 229 indigenous tribes in Alaska, more than half of all of the indigenous tribes in the United States. Most of these communities are not connected by road. The only way that you can get to them are by small 10-seater planes. And so when extreme weather events come in, and this is the time when extreme weather events happen. So we don't have hurricanes in Alaska, but we have hurricane-strength winds. And I hope you think about the communities here, because we're about to have another extreme weather event next week. There's no evacuation roads. People can't drive out of their communities to get to safety. And there's no higher ground. So the need for protection and for figuring out how to make relocations possible is critical. And the other thing that I would add is, in talking about this in the context of disasters, and being a lawyer in the United States and familiar with the disaster legislation here, sea level rise and erosion are not disasters. So there's no mechanism in place to help communities who are being impacted by sea level rise and erosion. We were really fortunate that President Obama has taken a serious interest in the Arctic, and I think it's because of the tremendous advocacy that the tribes have done. And for those of you who may know, he traveled to our state last year, which was historic, and he wanted to go to Kälin, which is one of the communities that needs to relocate, but his plane couldn't land there because the airstrip, which is on a dirt airstrip, it was eroding so severely that his plane couldn't land. But he did go north of the Arctic Circle and did meet with community members. And it's because of their advocacy that he put in this report, recognizing that there is a significant institutional gap in the United States in regard to facilitating a planned relocation, and that his administration has recognized that they need to take a lead internationally in figuring this out. So in the work that we're doing in Alaska, there are 3 critical governance issues that have not been figured out, that we're trying to figure out with the Obama administration and with the tribes and with the state of Alaska. So one is once a community has made that decision to relocate, which federal or state government agency is responsible for facilitating that relocation? There is no federal or state government agency in the United States that has that responsibility. And so even though Kälin, Shishmaref, and Newtok made the decision decades ago to relocate, they have not been able to get safe and relocate because we have no institutional mechanism or agency to facilitate that relocation. And that's a really critical issue. But the issue that I'm really concerned about that's going to take a lot more work, if we are trying to prevent these crises from happening, we need to be thinking, and not only in Alaska, but in Boston and Miami and South Carolina, at what point in time should a community relocate prior to being displaced by a hurricane, like Hurricane Matthew that just came up the eastern seaboard? We have no idea when that should happen, and we now are working on a project with the state and the Obama administration and several Alaska Native tribes to try to figure this out. The third piece is we have to make sure that human rights are protected. And the reason why I say that in this context is because the only models that we have for planned relocation are relocations that have been mandated by governments. And what we know about those relocations is they have led to the uniform impoverishment of people and the fracturing of their social networks. And we have that experience in Alaska not that long ago. During World War II, Japan bombed the Aleutian Islands, and the federal government made the decision to relocate the Anungan people, and 10% of the people died as a consequence of that forced relocation. So we cannot use the models that have existed in regard to relocation, and one of the critical pieces is this human right to self-determination. Communities must be making the decision about when, how, and where they relocate. And then finally, why the Arctic matters. President Obama, as a follow-up to the conference that he had in Alaska, just had for the first time an Arctic science ministerial meeting in Washington, D.C., and 26 countries attended because of the serious concern about the loss of Arctic sea ice and the Greenland ice sheet and the consequences for communities all over the world. Thank you.
Thanks to all 3 of you for a great discussion an introduction to the issues and elaborating on certain elements of that. I'm going to ask one question to get the discussion started and then turn it over to the audience. And that relates to the linkage or the intersection between the local and global efforts. So Robin talked very much about some of the national challenges in national law, and also the very local perspective and the need to respect the communities. And I'd like to ask you, Robin, how the international initiatives we heard from could help your efforts. And then to flip the question for Walter and Jane, you talked about the importance of international, the need for more international law, or the importance of things like the Nansen initiatives. And how do you think there's a recognition of importance of communities, but how could that community efforts better inform the international efforts? So you can go in any order you please. Robin, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, and we were really unfortunate. So I was really unfortunate to be invited to participate in the Nansen Initiative and also now on the platform on disaster displacement. And it's the information about what's happening, the research about what's happening in these communities that informs the international agenda of the complexity of issues that are at stake. And I would say in regard to how the international norm setting is critical for local communities, because it's at the international level that we have a human rights discussion. And I think that, when we talk about this issue, we have to always put human rights at the forefront. And I think, one of the gaps in international human rights law is this concept of collective human rights. It's enunciated in very few circumstances, like in the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but it's really important that we figure out what this collective right to self-determination means in this context.
Thank you. Walter?
I think we have to distinguish between cross-border displacement and preventing displacement within countries, and also internal displacement. When we're talking about cross-border displacement, this is still a world based on the notion of nation state and borders. So it's the governments that decide, and that's why kind of the international discussion is important. However, what we found and what the protectionist agenda is stressing is the discussion really has to be at the regional, sub-regional levels, because there are huge differences. The whole issue in the Pacific as compared to drought, rising sea levels in the Pacific, small island states, as compared, for instance, to drought in the Horn of Africa. This must be adapted solutions. You cannot find solutions that fit to all the situations. When it comes to all that is being done within countries, then of course communities are extremely important. We know, for instance, when we're talking about disaster risk reduction, besides the mega infrastructure projects, again, that's more for the governments to do. What really works are local and community-based approaches. And I don't see any kind of contradiction between international processes and discussions and localized initiatives, because if you don't have the international discourses, then nobody will listen to the local communities. So this is, for them, a good way also to have their voices heard at the right level. And the other way around, if it's just at the top levels without the knowledge of what's going on in realities, then everything will remain, if you excuse this, a university academic.
Yes, I'd echo a lot of that. And in fact, I think that was one of the huge advantages of the Nansen Initiative, and I was also privileged to be part of that, was that this wasn't a theoretical exercise. The starting point was not, here is the law, what should the law be? It was constantly informed by the empirical evidence, by the discussions with local communities and governments. And I think that being informed from the bottom up meant that the responses that were then sort of shaped were attuned to the needs and the conditions in the particular regional contexts. I mean, a good example would be, as had been the case in a lot of the scholarship, to approach a country like Kiribati or Tuvalu and say, oh, well, these will be the world's first climate refugees, we need to expand the refugee definition. And as Walter said, there's a very, very strong rejection of the refugee concept in those countries. And not least, it's because of the idea that that is somehow linked to incredible vulnerability and being reliant on the international community. And what people say is we want to migrate with dignity, have choices, have options. Now, if that had not been fed into the process, we may have come up with a very different set of, so-called solutions that would have been actually really maladaptive to what we're seeing on the ground. And I think too that the case studies, not the case studies, but the commissioned research that fed into the process was absolutely fundamental there. So I guess to come back to Walter's final point, the academic fed into through field work and empirical kind of studies was then also linked up with the kind of more normative conceptual ways of coming to solutions.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to open it up to any questions. I don't know if we have a mic running around. No? Okay, so just speak loudly and please identify yourself. Any questions?
I have a question for Robin. What's the role of FEMA in disaster displacement?
So for folks that maybe who couldn't hear, the question was, what's the role of FEMA in regard to disaster displacement? And so part of the challenge with FEMA is that you have to have a disaster, and in the context of the relocations that need to happen for Shishmaref, Kälin, and Newtok, it's now accelerated rates of erosion and permafrost thawing that are causing their imminent risk. And those environmental hazards are not part of the definition of a disaster according to FEMA. So they could get FEMA assistance if there was another extreme weather event like is going to happen next week. But aside from that, FEMA, there is no role for FEMA.
I'm Salwa Kaswani from the University Service Committee, and I have a question to Jane and Walter regarding this international framework. Yesterday, Mary Robinson mentioned that existing refugee protections are sufficient to protect the rights of those that are displaced. What I'm hearing is that that's not enough. That's not enough. We need to create a new to protect the rights of those that are displaced. Is there consensus at the international level on what should be done, and what's the role of community, civil society organizations like us in terms of advocating for that legal protection? What would it be?
Well, I think there was no contradiction. The two of us very much agree that we should not go for a new international treaty for different reasons, and Jane can explain that because she published a whole article on that issue. However, what we need is to build on the existing practices, to formalize them, to harmonize them, and this starts at the domestic level. There could be bilateral agreements. Just to mention an example, Panama and Costa Rica are in the process of negotiating a bilateral treaty on disaster management, and the idea is to integrate cross-border movements into that treaty. I don't know how far they get, but that's an approach. Then there is certainly a potential for regional both soft law and treaties. When we're talking about treaties, in several parts of the world we have free movement of persons arrangements, like for instance in Western Africa and ECOWAS. These have been introduced mainly for economic purposes, to facilitate cross-border movements in a more economic commercial context. But we see, for instance, in Western Africa that during times of drought, people use that. For instance, people moving to the big cities in the neighboring country to make some money so the family can stay behind and survive, even though there is drought. But even in ECOWAS region, pastoralists have the possibility to cross borders legally, so this would be a regional arrangement. In the Pacific, I think there will be a discussion about how to facilitate this migration with dignity. And again, it remains to be seen whether this will be soft law or whether there will be bilateral treaties or something even regional or sub-regional. So it's more this kind of, again, bottom-up approach, pragmatic approach. But it's not that we have sufficient, no. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the problems. We need to move ahead. But to have a global treaty would be very problematic, and I think.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, in terms of some of the reasons why, it would be problematic. I mean, one is that, as I said at the outset, most of the movement we're going to see is internal displacement, not cross-border. So a treaty wouldn't be of use for the internal, which is the vast majority of movement. Now, that doesn't mean you don't create a treaty, but it does actually, in terms of an issue that needs a lot of solutions, and many of which can be at the national level, the responsibility of national governments towards their own citizens and people living in their country. It could be a lot of political capital being spent on something where actually the greatest number of people are not going to be assisted. We have a refugee convention that is ratified by 148 countries, and yet we have the largest number of refugees in the world since that treaty was initiated. So simply having a legal instrument doesn't mean the problem is solved. It takes political will to implement it. And it's very clear there's no political appetite at the moment for any new instrument on protection. Those pragmatic concerns aside, there's also a more conceptual question about why climate change and this attribution issue that Walter raised. How do you show that you have been displaced by the impacts of climate change? How do you show that the cyclone that hit your country was, caused by climate change? Climate scientists tell us that that's just a really false way of looking at it. Climate change is a trend. An increase in the severity of a cyclone is consistent with the trend of climate change, but it's false to say climate change caused this and didn't cause that. Then it comes back to the point of, and why not earthquakes and tsunamis that can't be linked to climate change? But then, is it arbitrary in other ways? Why don't we then say that systemic poverty, that we could argue goes back to global financial systems, should not also be a ground on which people can seek protection? So why climate change and not these other things?
Okay, one more question in the back row there.
Based on communal land owning or based on institutional homelands, how that is integrated into the conversations of, dignified migration, and how that's maybe brought up. Is that even brought up in regards to how different communities are using it?
Yeah. That's a great question. Thank you. And yes, absolutely. In Alaska, that is, I would say, one of the primary issues in regard to not necessarily the decision to relocate, but how that relocation will occur, and why I go back to what I said earlier about the collective right to self-determination, why that's so critical. And just as a final point, for me, it's like the recognition that it is our collective failure to control greenhouse gas emissions that are causing people to have to leave the places that they love is a really heavy responsibility that I take living in the United States, because, yesterday we heard 75 million people around the world live within 1 meter of the coastline. If we have anywhere near what the projections are in regard to how sea level rise is going to accelerate by the end of the century, a lot of people are going to be losing their homes.
Great. Well, I want to just in conclusion say I was very intrigued by the way that Walter described the Nansen Initiative as state-led and bottom-up. That's not a combination you hear of very often, and I think that's a great way to think of this, of the global and local, and obviously regional and national in the middle. So I just want to thank the 3 clinics that have helped organize this event, the International Human Rights Clinic, the Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, and the Immigration and Refugee Clinic, and thank you for coming, and thank our panelists for speaking today.